Welcome to our webinar this Friday morning on what I believe is going to be quite an exciting and certainly thought-provoking and challenging session. We've got a very distinguished panel with us today, internationally convened. So alongside myself and Cecilia from the British Chamber and my colleague Ima in Mission Control, we have Amanda Wild, Managing Director from Zini Healthcare. And we have Johan de Brave, CFO of Task. Welcome, Johan. And Professor Andreas Diakon, founder and director and CEO of Task. And this morning we are talking about facing the virus, medicine, the media, and the modern pandemic. And I suppose that last week we might have taken our eyes slightly off COVID and where we're at. I often do a sense check of the media in the morning and at night. And last night it was all about George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, actually very troubling scenes that we've seen in the US and in the UK, and something that we're not taking lightly and is a topic we want to address on another day. I was also reading about how the UK economy has contracted 20% this last quarter, the largest contraction in over 300 years. But again, a lot of the reason for this and the catalyst for a lot of this has been COVID and the way the world has responded to COVID and actually essentially locked down the economies. And we've seen some stark statistics coming out of that in terms of which societies and communities and parts of ethnic groups are suffering more. So we've got quite a few topics that we're going to discuss this morning, and we're very honored to have our distinguished panelists and guests join us to actually share some of the empirical data that will help us really explore what is the impact of COVID, what is the impact of the media response, and actually what are the solutions moving forward so we can get back to some type of normality. As ever, I'll be chairing, Cecilia will be coordinating and feeding in your questions, so please be as interactive as possible using the Q&A function, and we may call upon several guests to speak. We welcome our friends from Carte Blanche who are joining us this morning. We're also intrigued by this topic, and I'd like to kick off by handing over to the good professor to take us through some of the slides that show some of the empirical data and your observations. Prof. Andreas, thank you.
Oh, welcome everybody. I'm getting on top of this. I hope you can see this screen and you can actually hear me as well. So just like every other community out there, the medical community has also been taken by surprise by COVID-19. And of course we have adjusted to it. And those not directly involved in it, which is a part of my life I am and part of my life I'm not. And here I'm actually speaking as one that is not. I'm a researcher in tuberculosis, and this is the usual talk I give. And you can see that in the title, I had to change everything. So I can no longer talk about new TB drugs. Now I have to talk about that virus, like everybody else seems to only talk about that virus nowadays. But still, some slides about tuberculosis, it's still there. You know, it's probably been with us humans since we were invented. It's traveled with us from Africa across the planet and back. And we still have the most deadly infection globally podium position as tuberculosis researchers. 10 million new cases every year, 1.5 million deaths, 20% of them are HIV positive. We have increasing problems with drug resistance, and more than 1 million children has tuberculosis every year. In the Western Cape, you know, we can expect 56,000 TB cases. And so far, we're, I think, not there yet with the COVID numbers. And obviously, most of the COVID numbers will be mild disease, whereas tuberculosis is always dangerous. So in 1851, that's the recorded day, 1 in 4 people in the populated world at the time was killed by tuberculosis. And since 2016, we're doing a bit better after quite a deterioration of things with HIV that makes it more easy for people to contract that disease and die from it. Well, so this is what we usually do. You know, we find new tuberculosis drugs, and then we show that if you treat people with them, they do better. So the blue line would be how they convert their positive sputum cultures from the lungs, so within weeks, and that we can shorten the duration of treatment and make it more safe. That's what I usually do, but nowadays I can't do that. And the reason why we are out there in the communities is obviously because tuberculosis is just as as contagious, probably even worse. And so we have to go to where the patients are. We can't bust them into a center and risking transmission everywhere. And so all these red dots over the map of Cape Town show sites where we do drug research. Some of them are called DTTC. I poached this from the Desmond Tutu TB Center at Stellenbosch University, who are doing similar things in children, what we do in adults. And we even have a place in George, Task Eden, but you get in Stellenbosch, there's one. So you get the impression of a decentralized organization. We are the world leader in proof of concept studies with new tuberculosis drugs. It can't be done better anywhere than here because we have so much of that disease. Our organization employs about 150 doctors, nurses, pharmacists, microbiologists, drivers, teachers, quality assurance people, data people, what you can imagine these people are. And we mostly grant funded from overseas, either European Union, there is some UK involvement, and the United States. So now COVID-19 level 5 affected us as well because they just stopped everything we do. It says my connection is unstable. I hope you can hear me. So TB treatment and vaccine research out there in all these little outposts was just stopped. We were considered not essential and couldn't access these clinics anymore. It was a very unhappy moment for us, but then we of course recovered immediately and started a vaccine study with a very old tuberculosis vaccine to protect healthcare workers. You might have heard about this. It gave me some very unexpected media exposure, much more than I thought. So this is now running. We are halfway through our first 500 contingent that we want to do, but I don't actually want to talk about this. And this is not the COVID-19 vaccine, right? It's a TB vaccine that might protect us from severe COVID-19 disease, hopefully. And then I started some, letters, just like you do the session now. I wrote to my staff. I wrote little letters every day or every other day about this epidemic, because not everybody was in the office anymore. It was a little bit difficult to reach them and also get their emotional state. So I'm now at edition probably 50-ish, and some interesting things. This is, for instance, why social distancing works for COVID, right? So that these green droplets, I hope they come across green on your screens as well, they don't go any further than 2 meters usually. Whereas the tuberculosis droplets, they will fly, so they can actually disperse in the air and be carried with the stream, and so they actually fly further than COVID. So wearing masks and just keeping your distance works with COVID, and just please do that. It really does work. Here is just lockdown, right? This was taken at the same time. These are airborne planes. So you can see who can complain about what when they see the spread of the virus numbers in different countries and economical environments. You can see Africa is just empty, no more airplanes. So these are some numbers. You've probably seen most of these, but so this is cases per million corrected for populations, and you see Switzerland is high up there. This is the place where I come from, so I have followed this very intensely. It's close to Italy, so they had an early and relatively bad epidemic. South Africa, with that lockdown, has probably managed to delay it a lot. If you compare these curves, we're probably just at the start of the first logarithmic phase there. And so this is the death in Switzerland. It's also basically 0. And in South Africa, it hasn't actually really started to reach the levels they saw elsewhere. So in Switzerland now, this is a very interesting slide. They can now sort of have a balance of what happens. So these are the years, from left to right, and its mortality in the population. And the lower gray band is the people aged from 0 to 64 and their mortality, which is low and is constant and is not much influenced by seasonal or other events. And at the top are people aged 65 or older, and they are more likely to die in winter, statistically, and with what they call eine starke Grippewelle, which is a flu wave. So every winter or every second winter this happens. And if on the right side you look at that, you can see that the COVID-19 impact, now of course under lockdown conditions, which this. They don't do this when there's normal flu, but they have a flu vaccine campaign. That's something. But it's now they can say it was a bit like a perhaps twice as bad flu wave, and it mainly affected people 65 years or older, because the mortality in the younger people was basically unchanged. So this is now the first time somebody can actually now look at the tally of lives that this COVID-19 wave had, and I find that very interesting if you compare it to the economical measures that have been taken to get it there where it is. So this is one other interesting thing, you know, about other epidemics. This is actually what I want to talk about. So look at that on the left, coronavirus, 2.1 billion mentions in the media, and tuberculosis. If you can see my point here, this is TB in the same time, this little square there. And if you look at the death tally, tuberculosis is still ahead of COVID-19. It's still more people die every day from tuberculosis than COVID-19, which just puts it a bit into perspective how much overemphasis or emphasis, perhaps overemphasis, we are giving to this COVID-19 situation. So our recruitment, we looking for tuberculosis patients. So over the years, we have this like constant diagnosis of 40 a week-ish, you know, and of those we can get between 5 and 10 onto a study. Then there is December, January, and everything closes down. But now in April, the same happened, right? There was lockdown and people stopped coming to the clinics to be tested for TB. The blue bars disappeared. And this is a problem because tuberculosis doesn't heal itself like COVID. It's just out there, and these people keep being out there and they keep coughing their tuberculosis bacteria under lockdown conditions, not all, in their little confined spaces into the atmosphere, and other people will inhale them and will become infected. And you can see it's still not normal. And the NICD, the national body, has actually registered the same thing, because it's a notifiable disease, and the supplies for TB testing are centrally distributed. And this has been dropped below 50%, the tuberculosis testing rate. And because the number of cases has been constant over years, you can basically calculate how many undiagnosed cases are walking around out there because of lockdown and being scared to come to the clinics. And this organization called Stop TB, it's a global organization that is fighting for tuberculosis, has tried to estimate what this means. So on the left, you have mortality, the number of cases. On the right is mortality, how many people die from the disease. And so they are looking at a 2 or 3 month lockdown with some recovery period, and are estimating how many more tuberculosis cases or infections will now occur because these people aren't taken out of circulation, and their treatment is late and it's interrupted, and all these services. And you can see both the death and the case rates increase substantially. And the numbers there estimate that there is a delay of TB diagnosis, no effective treatment given. And in a typical 3 month lockdown with a 10-month restoration period, another 6.3 million cases will be recorded in the next 5 years. And another 1.4 million deaths will be recorded in the next 5 years. And this is just because the TB services were interrupted for a short while, and people didn't want to access them because of TB, what I call COVID hysteria. And so the improvements that we've seen with many, many millions of investment over the last 3 years will be obliterated completely by that lockdown. And we will probably go back to the numbers that we saw last between 2013 and 2016. Yeah, so it's my last slide. So I used to work in Davos in Switzerland, and now I often in Brooklyn Chest Hospital in Cape Town on the right. And I like both places, and you can see how similar they are, right? There's mountains and there is clouds and there's fences and houses. It's basically the same thing, but with this COVID epidemic, I'm not entirely sure if doing the same things in both countries is right. And I think this is what this whole session here is about. You know, are we doing the right thing in South Africa, mimicking what they did in the first world and what worked there? But I'll leave it here, and thank you for listening.
Leon, you just unmute.
Sorry, guys, you missed my impassioned soliloquy to the screen there. Just really enjoying your presentation there, Prof, and the stats that you shared. And the key phrase I come away with is COVID hysteria. But looking at the opportunity cost of what this is costing other illnesses, other pandemics that we seem to have ignored for the last 2-3 months. Perhaps, before I invite comments from the rest of the panelists, essentially taking on board that presentation, that data. You know, we're 2 weeks into level 3, you know, looking at the numbers in infections comparatively, you know, have we peaked yet? What do we see coming? And perhaps looking to the audience, having heard what you've heard in the media, having heard what you've heard just now, what do you think about lockdown? Was it called too early, too late, or more or less at the right time? It'd be great to get your views on that. And perhaps, as we're waiting for those results to come in, Amanda, your observations on what the good professors just shared with us? Just,
I think, Leon, and thank you, Prof. From our particular business is wound care, amongst other things, and I think we echo what you've seen, Prof, in terms of the drop-off in TB clinic visits. Virtually all of the chronic wound care in South Africa is performed in hospital clinics. So unlike UK, where we have a national health service and the district nurses go to the patient's home, in South Africa the bulk of the patients come to hospital clinics. And we saw likewise an absolute drop off a cliff edge in terms of, so there's been no wound care happening either. Patients were given plastic bags of products and sent away. And this has had an impact. And I think the one thing that wound care has taught us is it's not the hole in the patient, it's the whole of the patient. And although we're of the opinion that the lockdown was probably called at the right time, we didn't necessarily think holistically in terms of the impact that what we did was going to have on everything else. I think that's my main comment, Leon, and I'll discuss it more later. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Amanda. Johan, any observations from your side?
Yeah, I think, you know, the love him or hate him, Donald Trump said at the beginning of this thing, he said that the cure can't be worse than the disease. And at the time, I was quite horrified about his comments. I think what Andreas said was that is exactly right, is each country should look at its own population and what's going on within their population and find the right answers to that. We've got quite a unique population in terms of, and as you said with George Floyd at the moment, we're quite divided between the haves and the have-nots, and we extremely vulnerable in terms of the clinics and the hospitals that need to be able to operate. Otherwise, we're going to have the knock-on effect that you saw there on not just TB, but HIV and Hep B and all of those other illnesses are going to really have a huge impact down the line for us if we don't find solutions that speak to our community and our population.
Yeah, thanks, Johan. Perhaps I can just guide you all to the Q&A section on your screens. I see some questions coming up in the chat. It'd be great if you could type them into the Q&A and Cecilia can feed those in. And perhaps we can share the poll results, Ema, as we're just reflecting. Interesting. Any comments to that, Prof? Our audience is suggesting that only 25% say it was too early, 0% say too late, and 3/4 of us were saying it was called more or less at the right time. What are your thoughts on our audience's views there?
My thoughts, sorry, we were encouraged to be a bit controversial here. But
please do.
I can't really. I mean, part of me works in one of these hospitals that is looking after these patients, and we did need this time to prepare. So from that perspective, I would think, like as a consumer of the benefits of the lockdown, I think it was a good thing. If now all the economical consequences, and not being able to cycle on the mountain for such a long time was really necessary. I can't tell, but perhaps someone else has a more global view on this.
Yeah. What are you thinking there, Amanda?
I'm thinking along the same lines, but also with some differences, Leon, that the preparing was important. It definitely was. But I think the step we missed was the lateral thinking. It's very easy when you're in panic mode to only look at the thing that's immediately in front of your nose, if that makes sense. And what are we going to deal with? We'll deal with COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2. What are we going to do? We're going to bat it on the head like whack-a-mole. So at the end of the day, we went into reaction mode rather than proactive thinking. And I think this reflected in terms of how the enthusiasm for the lockdown waned quite quickly, because once you've got a country to agree with you, you have to keep them agreeing with you. And the only way you're going to keep them agreeing with you and going along is if there's a good explanation for why you're doing what you're doing. And I think as the good explanations fell away, that was part of the problem. And it is retrospect and it is hindsight. But we would always say in our particular area of healthcare, you've got to think sideways about not just the consequences of what you're doing, but also the consequences of what you're not doing for that time period. Children have missed the opportunity to play out for how many months now? Where do children get their immunity from? They get it from being in the playground, outdoors, boosted. We've taken all that away. So I think we could bear doing an analysis of all the things we've missed. And it's not just TB and HIV. We've missed fundamental building blocks in the care of our young people and the development of our young people and other aspects of healthcare as well.
No, thanks, Amanda. And I think we'll come back to that opportunity cost. Prof, you wanted to come in there?
Yeah, sorry, Amanda actually said what I also wanted to say. You know, even within the medical fraternity, especially from the research side, I must say I found it not ideal that, you know, people that are actively working on other epidemics like TB and HIV, that we were basically stopped from working on things that would clearly not go away because of COVID-19. But this was eventually recognized. We could petition the minister, and if ever we go back to lockdown 5, so our activities will no longer be considered non-essential. We will be given access to the clinics. So this also shows that we're all doing this for the very first time. And as long as those making the rules are actually monitoring them and are listening and are trying to correct the mistakes made, I think it's okay.
Yeah, no, thanks. Before I just hand over to Cecilia to field some questions, just what essentially the holistic view, looking sideways, what are the opportunity cost consequences? It's worth us coming back to explore that. For me, it extends into the challenges of being a leader and the terrible decisions that leaders are faced with. And I think we're very forgiving initially. We'll give people an opportunity, we will follow, but we'll lose that trust very quickly if the data, the evidence, and the quite often arrogance and lack of professionalism in briefing ensues. And I think that's been critical in how the mood has shifted as we've gone throughout lockdown. And now, Cecilia, we've got a few questions coming in there.
Yeah, we've got a few. I'm going to start with Duncan's question first. This sort of feeds into, again, sort of being completely reactionist, where we just sort of are faced with something immediately. And now we've got a little bit of hindsight. We've got a little bit of data, so we can start thinking ahead. Duncan is asking, how do we now petition or advocate for the SA or to the SA government to transition the COVID-19 temporary infrastructure to TB isolation and treatment? You know, we go from a temporary, what is probably a temporary problem, and as Professor Diakon also pointed out, something that is self-healing, to TB, which is not. Which has been a consistent problem and isn't self-healing. Any input on that, Amanda or Johan?
I think that would be super. I think if there's one positive thing we can take out of this is use the things we've developed for it for some use afterwards. some positive use. There has to be a legacy that comes out of this learning experience. And I think in the same way as we struggled to find a use for the football stadiums after the World Cup, it's about doing the same thing with the health structure that we've put in place. I know we want national health coming, and I'm fully in support of it, but doing something useful with all of this and having it stay there as a legacy to the one point in time where we could be well prepared, I think is really important.
Thanks, Amanda.
Yeah.
I saw Johan nodding and the professor nodding. Perhaps we could come to you first, Johan.
Yeah, I think I want to agree there. And there's a little bit of a juggling act here, because having been maybe as one of the early movers in terms of finding solutions for COVID, we've now got some less favorable engagement from certain parties on this the hindsight scenario. So there will be scrutiny, exactly as you guys say, and whether you've done something well or something bad, everyone's going to ask questions whether that was the right thing to do at that point. And you either come out as the hero or the villain. But I think you can't do nothing. Inactivity going forward is going to be the thing that the next pandemic will catch us out on, and so we need to move forward and put things in place from a fundamental and systemic point of view, so that when the next thing comes around, whether that then in the interim helps TB, HIV, and all of these other illnesses, fantastic, but we need to be prepared. So I agree with what Amanda said, but we also need to be cognizant that there is a civil society out there that's looking for everything that's possibly negative out of this, whether the intention was good or bad. We are in the spotlight.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Johan. Prof, you wanted to come in there?
Yeah, thanks, Johan. I tried to think we should look at what we currently don't do well, and one of them is testing. And there, one wonders, why does a country like South Africa not have their own manufacturing capacity for test kits? Why can't we make our own masks? Why can't we make our own shields? Why do we have to rely on other people to make this for us? I think this is something that, can directly flow into investment and in sustainable manufacturing capacity, that we now clearly see there is a need now. And, this is not the last virus that will be coming out of there. And that's probably a message that everybody will take further.
Yeah, and I think that leads us nicely into our next topic, and perhaps we could just run our next poll, Ema, in terms of how has South Africa managed this crisis? How confident have you felt in our leadership? So I need to read this out for the live recording. How confident have you felt in South Africa's leadership? Very confident, reasonably, not very, completely lacking confidence. And then the next question there that we're asking at the same time is, what is the main reason for this level of confidence? And as the audience are answering those questions, we can wait for them to come back. Perhaps, I know you wanted to say something, Prof, but actually looking at the testing, looking at the mortality rates in the hardest hitting provinces, what do we put those differences down to at this stage? Is it testing? Is it the lockdown was managed better? Is it the demographics? What are the thoughts there? Perhaps, Amanda, we could come to you.
I think, at the beginning, there was seemingly a lot of information and a lot of clear demonstration of decisions being made on the basis of information, if that makes sense. I think it was the falling away that caused the problems, that when the explanations weren't there with the decisions, then this is when you lose people, and this is a basic of leadership. And that if you have not set a compelling vision for what it is you want to do and move forward, this is when you lose people. So one of the big reasons we've got a 5-year political term was because of how we used to view leaders in the past, and if they didn't stand up to par, they were either sent away or executed in that time period. So that's pretty much how we get to a 5-year time period in politics, is because that's typically how long it takes for a group of people to become very disillusioned with what's going on. But clearly in a panic situation, you lose faith sooner. So I think the fact that there was less compelling reasons for why we were doing what we were doing, this is a big reason why they lost the buy-in that they could have maintained if they just kept up with the principles.
Sure. Johan, did you want to come in there?
No, I agree with Amanda. I think only if you were living in New Zealand at the moment were you completely happy with your leaders. I don't think there's a country globally that hasn't got some kind of unhappiness, happiness split, however those percentages look, and whether you live in the UK or in the US or wherever. I mean, people are disillusioned with their leaders in some form or another. But I agree with Amanda, is that everyone in South Africa initially were fairly happy with the decision-making process and how it came about. I think that's now completely waned off. I think now we start seeing people challenging every single decision that's being taken is being challenged. And this is where we need firm leadership and people to stand by their principles and say, we're taking these decisions for these and these and these reasons. Yes, it's going to hurt this sector of the economy and the population, but there's a long-term goal here, which we're not seeing at the moment. And I think that's where the disillusionment, and I mean, our office is on one of the busy roads in Cape Town down here. You just look outside the window and it looks like a normal day. There's no people, lockdown in their minds is non-existent at the moment. And I'm hoping we don't see, and there's a lot of talk of the second wave. We haven't even really got the first wave under wraps yet, but I really hoping we don't see a spike from what's happening at the moment.
Can I commend here, Johan, you speaking of waves, and that's exactly, we briefly touched on the peaks, but that's another question we've got, particularly from Stuart Stoddard. And I'm also looking for some more indication from you guys who are all experts with different perspectives, but what is everyone's opinion on when we will actually hit the peak?
No, I think that's Prof is best to answer that one.
I'm very hesitant to be an oracle on this one. I mean, as a scientist, there is currently nothing, no special mojo or anything known to South Africa that would make us have a different curve than other countries. And seeing that social distancing is perhaps a bit more of a challenge than elsewhere, I would expect the numbers to go up for quite a while, perhaps a few weeks. I don't know, but I'm really not an expert here. And those people that are experts, they are modeling this and they're making these model curves, and they accumulate more information to inform these models, you know, as time goes along. And I think we should trust them to be the most likely ones to get it right. Not necessarily perfectly well, but you know, nowadays everybody's an expert. Everyone's on some Facebook group or WhatsApp and has an opinion about COVID-19. I must say, I find it very difficult to really make predictions.
Thanks, Prof. Amanda, I saw you wanted to come in there. Yeah.
Look, I think there are some principles that are parallel across infectious diseases, if that makes sense. But it's a bit like looking at a garage of cars. I mean, they've all got different engine sizes and they've got different capabilities. And I think this is the thing that makes the infectious diseases most difficult. You don't know what's underneath the bonnet until you get under the bonnet, basically, and see what it actually contains and what it's capable of. So we can project and project and project until the cows come home, but we're only going to know what it was actually capable of doing and what we did right and what we did wrong at the end of all of this, when we go back into reflection mode. So I think there's too many variations, although there's similar principles. An infectious disease will be infectious. There's also too many variables as well to be accurate about it. So I think we've got to be realistic when the projections do come out. You've got to take them with a degree of wishful thinking as well as reliability, that people are doing their best. They're not deliberately trying to upset everyone, and take it for what it is, which is best guess at this point.
I mean, it appears we've been waiting for this big upsurge in cases in Africa and South Africa. I know we've seen a shift in Central America and perhaps some underreporting of the stats there. In fact, Ema, if you just hold on the results of the poll, I just want to move on to actually looking at global statistics. We can take the World Health Organization. We're relying on each country to manage their own statistics, and but that's why the UK is second highest, because we've been the most thorough in how we've assessed, or the media's been so challenging. What are your views on the global statistics that are coming out and their ability to predict the peaks?
Yeah, I can let me come in. I like my stats as a finance person, but there's always going to be question marks in certain areas. I mean, there's huge question marks about what China is doing at the moment. They're going back all the way to August to say, well, actually the outbreak started back in August already, and it wasn't reported. They also questioning the speed with which the stats from China petered off, and they claimed that the pandemic was over in Wuhan province and those kind of things. Once again, coming back to Amanda's analogy of the cars, I think we can only look at our own stats and try and make a model that works for us. One of the things is any good statistician can pitch a nice little PowerPoint presentation to you the way that you want the outcome to look. And at the moment, I quite like the fact that some of the metros have moved away from how many infections we've had to what's our live infection count. I think that's much more of a honest reflection of whether that area or metro is doing well or not. The total infection count means nothing. I mean, whether it's 1 million or 5 million, if you've only got one infection, the fact that you had 5 million means nothing. But that's my point of view. I think the stats are being manipulated at a global level in certain areas, and you can only trust on what you know in your specific area or country.
Okay. Thanks, Jan.
I think you can't move away from the fact, Leon, that you can't drive a souped-up sports car over speed bumps at the end of the day. Do you know what I mean? The low profile and that everything is going to knock it sideways. So you need a vehicle that's designed for the terrain. If you want to get from point A to point B as quickly and as safely as possible, you need a solution that's designed for the environment that you're working in. And I think it's important as well that when you look on an evidence basis, evidence is only applicable as long as you can reproduce the conditions. So you can look at the most beautiful clinical trials and everything, but if you cannot reproduce the scenario in which that study was done and the way that study was done on the types of people that was done on, it's very difficult to then take a set of results and blanket apply them to everything. In fact, we're taught not to do that. So it's looking for evidence that is relevant and that is related to what we are doing. And then again, I would say it's as much what you don't do as what you do. So China, for example, I think, yes, they put that lockdown in place and they then said, oh, congratulate us, our death rate has plummeted. They've all forgotten they switched the factories off. So a lot of the cases in China, the pollution levels also drop like a rock. So what it seems is this virus is unmasking, whether it's a medical condition you've got or a particular body system problem that you've got. And the virus is literally bringing it to the front in some respects. So we have to think about all the things we're not doing as well as the things that we are doing, and what the impact is going to be in terms of what would the virus like to unmask next.
I think, Amanda, while you were speaking of terrain also, and I see Professor's got his hand raised, but this is a question to you specifically also, Professor. There have been some research on the effects of altitude on respiratory diseases, and also specifically on COVID-19. And we know, again, what might apply. There might be so many factors playing into one place at altitude versus a different place at altitude. But the question that came in is there anything to support that there could be a similar effect? As some of the research has shown, could there be a similar effect to support this in South Africa, the effects of altitude?
Some of us are considerably higher than others, but not at if you think about Gauteng versus Cape Town, for example. But our height isn't that high, if that makes sense, in terms of where the altitude really starts to cause problems. It's interesting. I mean, I've been trying to just educate myself as much as possible, watching everybody's point of view and listening to everybody's perspective. And there's a couple of good videos. Zach Bush that I've actually been watching, and he's very number one, he's a medic, but number two, his speciality is end of life care. So when you're dying, effectively, Zach is the person you want next to you. And he's also very interested in the environment. So I think, again, it is taking at this notion of what is it that the virus is trying to tell us. Because inevitably, when we have a problem like this, we have more than likely contributed to the cause of it. As a human race, we can't resist stomping all over everything, throwing chemicals around where we shouldn't be throwing them around, and inevitably we cause consequences in nature, and viruses are consequences in nature. So I think the altitude is only part of the story. I think it's also to do with pollution. I think it's to do with our medical wellness. The shift in the number of children in the USA, for example, that used to be diagnosed with chronic conditions versus today has altered radically, and it's on the radical increase. More children are obese today, more children are unwell, more children don't have the immune system that they used to have when some of us were considerably younger, and this has consequences. So I think altitude is one. They've looked at it, Cecilia, because some of the patients were manifesting with what looked like altitude sickness, this blue tinge and the difficulty. They've pulled it through the mill and they've said it's not exactly the same as altitude sickness. But I would say, again, the virus speaks to us. So what is it telling us, and what is the problem that we need to take care of in order to prevent this from happening again?
Thanks. Thanks, Amanda. And there's a couple of things we'll come back to. And what we're going to do, we'll take the prof's response, see the polls, then we'll queue up your slides after the next poll, because I think it talks to some of that as well. Andreas, you were going to come in there.
Oh, no, just a small remark about what happens in future. It's coming back to something we talked about earlier. So now that we know that HIV and TB are not major promoters of COVID-19, let's say my confidence in our modeling has increased a lot, because this removes that one factor that was unpredictable and that we couldn't learn from epidemics elsewhere that was unique to South Africa. You know, now that we know that this uniqueness doesn't factor into the models significantly, we can probably trust the models much more than before.
Yeah. Thanks. And can we just come back to how the government, how we felt we've been led? Would you have the results for that poll, Ema, that we can share? Okay, so how confident you felt in South Africa's leadership during this crisis? So 2/3 essentially, 57% reasonably confident, 32% not very confident, 11% completely lacking confidence. And what is the main reason for this level of confidence? Government's decisions broadly, 43%, government communications, 18%, lockdown regulations, 11%, implementation of lockdown regulations, 25%. So interestingly, I think we're there's a very kind audience, I would suggest, to how the government has managed this. And again, I'm here to represent your opinions, not particularly mine. But I welcome some observations there in terms of we're giving our government essentially a C- there for performance during this crisis. Does that tally, and perhaps people don't want to be overly controversial, but does that tally with what we're seeing? I'd be far more critical myself. From a communications perspective, I'm talking an F. From an early gripping the situation, B+. But in between, there's been a lot of poor leadership from my perspective. That's Leoneo speaking, not the chamber. I don't know if anyone would like to come in there.
I think likewise, Leon, at the beginning, a solid B, if that makes sense, sliding off the scale recently. I don't think there's a letter for it in terms of the latter. So I'll leave it diplomatically at that. And I think there was such an opportunity to use that initial wave of support to then build on it rather than let it slide under the door. And I think one of the things that didn't necessarily help was the distance, if that makes sense. That when you haven't got people close to each other saying, what in heaven's name are you thinking about this, and give me a good explanation for it. So the distancing has not helped. Because you're now making decisions at a distance and you're not on the ground and you're not seeing what's actually happening as a result of your actions or your inactions. And when you're not there on the ground, it's really difficult.
Yeah. Any observations there, Prof, in terms of our audience's reaction, or Johan, to the government's, or the feedback on the government's?
Yeah, I think they missed a golden opportunity here to cement the current administration. But I mean, I know the chamber has got much more clever political people or commentators there than myself. But I really think that they started the pandemic off with a bang, and I think they got the whole of the population behind them, or the bulk of it at least. But then it's just completely, as Amanda said, fallen off a cliff. I think the communication has been terrible of late. I think, as with a lot of, if you take a company structure, you can have a great leader, but if the foundation below him is not strong enough, then he's only as good as the people that communicate below him. And I think the people that underneath our president and underneath some of the ministers have been terrible in communicating and giving reasons why, and just keeping people updated with information, whether it's good or bad information. People just want to know, and I think that's been atrocious. I think there's been a lot of painting over the lines in terms of the testing and where the testing's been done and what's happening in the hospitals. I think there's been a lot of fear-mongering in certain areas for political reasons. So I think they missed a fantastic opportunity to galvanize the country. And I'm just, this is once again, as what's that caveat? This is Johan speaking, not task. I think it was a great opportunity to build something for the future here, which they missed.
Yeah. I know you've got some views on that, Cecilia, as well.
I might save them all for the end, but I do agree with everything Johan said, and particularly I think that the lack of communication. I think my other thing is also just the lack of any positive messaging, anyone taken into account from the beginning. Perhaps there's some factors that actually play in our favor. So since we all acknowledge that we're working with so many unknowns, and our projections, as Professor Diakon also said, are actually at best a bit of guessing shot here, but then why also not take some positive guesses? And I think the positive guessing has been completely lacking, the positive projections completely lacking, and the very negative, disastrous ones has been pitched as if it's a fact in the media. And I think that's where some of my gripes come in. And I got the idea, the idea for me from government regulations and messaging was that they solely took that on board instead of anything else. But I'll leave that towards the end. let's get on to the next poll. Shall I just read this one, Jan?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Next poll. How has your confidence in government's handling of the pandemic changed over time since before lockdown began? Has there been no change? Confidence has increased somewhat. Confidence has increased a lot. Confidence has decreased somewhat, or confidence has decreased a lot. We can get our attendees' opinions on that.
Cool. And Amanda, perhaps while people are answering, you can queue up your slides there, and just really on this broader theme in terms of what are the alternative treatments out there? What are the other factors? What are we thinking around herd immunity versus vaccine versus other treatment options? And tell us a bit about the work you've been doing in collaboration with TASK as well. Just checking you're not muted there, Amanda. Your slides are up nicely.
Unmute. How's that?
Yeah.
Cool.
Works every time.
Every time. I think, look, going back again to being in wound care and having wound care as our speciality, if it's not taught as anything in the last 20 years, it's to think sideways, basically. And when you find a wounded patient, you really have to start looking very horizontally in terms of what is it that's caused this, what is it that's stopping it from healing. So you have a very lateral mind, think very holistic. So I would think on reflection, this is one area where we have not done as well as we could have done. And I'd score as, again, there isn't a letter for it, in terms of thinking holistically, considering the bigger picture, that even when we have got scientists on board, you want a range of scientists and you almost want a futurist on board as well, in terms of saying, now what are the consequences of either doing or not doing what you're actually proposing that it is that you do or don't do. I am totally in with you, Prof, in terms of local is lecker. It amazes me why we can't do 101 things more than we can. We have possibly got the most biodiverse country on the planet. And it's still the case that close on 50% of modern medicines are naturally derived. So it's worth thinking about that up to 50% of our current medicines base is still based on nature. Interestingly, the World Health Organization essential drugs list only contains 11% of nature-based products. So you have to start thinking, where is the mind think going in all of this? And I very much believe that when Mother Nature throws you up a problem, she usually throws you a solution lifeline as well. And maybe rather than focusing on treatments, we could have focused more on the fact that prevention is better than cure. That at the end of the day, particularly if you look at how the UK system is structured, Leon, there's a combination, yes, of treatment in terms of the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, but it is tied very resolutely to the health prevention unit or the health protection unit, basically, that says, how do you avoid getting ill in the first place? And yes, we need to focus on a vaccine for particularly vulnerable patients, vulnerable people, but where are the preventative mechanisms? Again, I'm going to go back to, we've got a wealth of plants. We know that plant lectins are effective fusion blockers. We know that probiotics are effective fusion blockers. And finally, the amount of disinfectant we've been pouring over everything, I'd love to see what crawls out of this in terms of being immune to just about everything that we throw at it. So there is going to be another infectious problem that comes along. I agree very wholeheartedly with Johan, we need to be better prepared next time. And equally, we need to assess how we've caused these problems in the first place. So we know that good cleaning is better than bad disinfection. If you do not disinfect effectively, you'd better be cleaning well in terms of that. And we have a very strong approach in this country to antimicrobial stewardship. So we think very carefully, typically, about where we use our antimicrobials in the treatment of patients. we have not necessarily applied that good thinking to the way we're currently caring for the country, if that makes sense to everyone. So our particular focus for the last few months has been looking at different ways of cleaning and sanifying, particularly hospitals. And one of the ideas that we've picked up that's been very well researched is environmental probiotics. So the way in which environmental probiotics work is that they rebalance the environment. And this is one of the information leaflets that we've produced recently. So what we're saying is that when you consider health and wellness of a population, you have to think about everything that that population comes into contact with. And at the moment, what's not coming into the conversation is the fact that we bump into, accidentally, millions of bacteria and viruses and other microbes each day. And we have been doing so for thousands of years. I mean, Prof touched on it earlier on. If you analyze us very carefully, we are effectively 50% microbial. We have a bacterial friend or a microbial friend for every body cell that we have. If you look at us on a genetic basis, we're also predominantly microbial in terms of what's going on there. So instead of killing everything, we've been looking at the notion of how do we strike a balance between humans and nature, and we've looked particularly at environmental probiotics. And what we can see from all the hospital work we've been doing is that actually we can outperform disinfectants and bleach and high alcohol-based sanitization, basically, because what the probiotics are doing is out-competing and being present in larger numbers versus the pathogens. Once you put a pathogen in the corner and you threaten it with being out-competed, it changes, and the way it changes is it loses its resistance to medicines. So the inadvertent gain we got out of this by going into a competitive mode rather than a kill everything mode is that in order to have the energy to reproduce, the resistant pathogens are losing their resistance, which is a really interesting observation. And then what we know is we can put probiotics on surfaces, we can put them on the skin, we can even put them in the air as well. And while they're there in the air, they actually produce their own antimicrobials. So Bacillus subtilis is actually quite potent in all of this. We've got a lot of evidence, and we have had for the past 10 years, that bacteria can help us fight viruses. Very, very effectively, and yet because it's fragmented and we're not pulling it together, this is part of the problem. So I think I would leave this little point on a note that I would love the mixture of advisors to include consequences, and to actually think on a much broader holistic basis in terms of the steps that we take to actually protect, number one, the population, and two, treat the patients that are actually falling to all sorts of infectious diseases. Can we look at it from a different perspective?
Yeah, I think Amanda, if I can quickly come in, we've had a question from Bronwyn Barlow, and you've scratched the microbial surface there a little bit, but she's particularly referring to you speaking about holding the virus hostage at previous webinars by pouring disinfectant on it and not, in essence, letting it run its course. Does this tie in? Does this tie in with the herd immunity position, and are we creating greater microbial imbalance?
No, it's really interesting because Prof pulled up the airplanes map early on at the beginning of the session, and I think it's important to bear in mind that viruses don't just catch airplanes, they actually catch air currents as well. So if you think about it, when you look at the way that an infectious pandemic normally pans out, there is a peak, there is a decline, there is typically a second wave, and then at the end of that, we've usually either found a vaccine for it or it's burnt itself out in terms of how it's going to do it. And for the first time in recorded history, we've effectively put all the gates down globally. So to the point of the TB patient that now is not going to the clinic, and getting their treatment, they're at home coughing and spluttering over everyone that's around them. We've done that on a much wider scale in terms of almost holding the virus in place and not permitting it to flow through in the same way. So that's what I mean by hostage. That's not the same as herd immunity, because I actually don't think Sweden were firm enough, if that makes sense. I think we could have been more selective about who we isolated until we knew the evidence for whether they were vulnerable or at least beyond a certain point. HIV, TB, elderly, we can see now it's diabetes. Diabetes is pretty much ahead of everything on the charts. Effectively, and being a well-controlled diabetic does not bring down your risk significantly. So as we gained information, we could have opened the gates more, if that makes sense, in terms of the information that we've got. But by holding it hostage, what I'm saying is we're not allowing it to move for the first time in history, as it probably would have done in every case previously. And the consequences of that are your forward thinking. We should have assessed that. What is the risk of us holding this virus effectively hostage and not allowing it to flow through in the way that it did? What could we do differently for the patients that are most vulnerable, that we know are vulnerable now and that we suspect could well be more vulnerable as well? And we didn't do a tailored approach. We threw a blanket over the planet. I mean, it's quite interesting. So if that helps you, Bridget, what I'm meaning is we're not letting it move how we normally let it move. Whether we had a choice before is a different discussion altogether. And so we don't actually know at this point what the consequences are going to be, because we've almost put all the gates down and stopped it. Does that make sense, Cecilia?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Makes sense.
I think
Thank you.
We're heading into our final 10 minutes of the session now. And before we kind of perhaps have some final questions, some concluding comments, I'd like to introduce Peter Durkin, Chief Scientific Officer from Afrobodies, who I believe has some positive news to share on the fight of COVID with us this morning. Peter, would you perhaps like to unmute yourself and tell us of your recent findings? Or perhaps not. There you go, Peter.
Hello,
Hi.
Okay, hi. Thanks, Leon. Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, so in brief, our company has been working away for the past 3 months, trying to develop neutralizing antibodies against COVID-19. So we're a South African-based biotechnology company. And we just got results last week from the Virus Research Center in Glasgow that shows that the antibodies that we have been developing can neutralize the virus. So basically, it stops the virus from infecting human cells. Now, the thing that's different about our antibodies is that we develop the antibodies by making use of the special immune system of alpacas. So basically, these animals produce a specific type of antibody that is very good at neutralizing viruses. So now, in South Africa, we have developed neutralizing antibodies against the virus. We can say that officially. So our next step now is to try to bring these antibodies closer to the clinic, and that's what we're busy working on now. So yeah, so
Fantastic.
It's exciting time.
It is. I mean, many congratulations, and it's great to have a South African business. And I believe you did some of your training in Manchester, which probably contributes to your academic excellence, as well as Stellenbosch, of course.
Of course.
I'm declaring an interest there, but that's great news. And actually, I know Ema has given us some feedback into what you guys have been doing. Essentially embracing science to solve problems is something we really should be celebrating. I don't know if the panel has any comments or observations to that interesting, fascinating news.
I think it's great, Leon, because it's thinking laterally, if that makes sense. Even if we do find a vaccine for COVID, you know, there's going to be the next one that comes along and the next one that comes along after that. So I think it is looking at the notion of a variety of approaches, because we know that viruses and bacteria get used to what we do to them quite quickly. They've got a sole mission, which is to get around everything we throw at them. So I think we need a creative and a multi-pronged approach rather than thinking straight down the line each time. How do we prevent the virus from getting through the epithelium in the first place? We can do that with fusion blockers. How do we treat it once it is through the epithelium and reduce the levels there? We can do that with the antibodies. How do we vaccinate in the future to prevent it taking advantage of us altogether? So it's a multi-pronged approach rather than a single track approach. And we know this works better with bacteria and viruses than one single line of attack.
Thanks, Amanda. Anything from our colleagues at Task?
I think anyone who takes advantage of this situation and is flexible and tries to look for a solution instead of problems has a great future. And this goes for this presentation. I mean, it's just great how such situations of crisis bring out, the innovative and entrepreneurial people that will probably now, get a little edge over the administrators and blockers of this world. That's a little personal remark.
Yeah. I think, there's quite a few topics that we still wanted to cover, but I'm conscious we're entering into the last 3 minutes. So I might suggest we perhaps hold on some of those for another iteration of this, because we're getting great feedback. And perhaps start our concluding comments, because I like to conclude on some silver linings and optimism. So I don't really want to dive into how the media have been scaremongering. Perhaps we'll save that for another time when that's come through. Perhaps, Cecilia, are there any final questions we have from our audience?
Yeah, I think just on our final topic around what we could possibly do in terms of vaccines or treatment options that, have started to rear their heads. We do have another question from Stuart Stoddard, and since Johan brought up old President Trump earlier, I think this one will also definitely bring up his face to many minds. But Stuart is asking, is there any potential to use UVB radiation to kill airborne pathogens, especially in high-risk areas like airports or densely populated areas? Not a total solution, but as a redundancy solution, as a way of possibly reducing the quantum of pathogens. Amanda.
It's very interesting, but I'm going to hold with my message that I think this kill notion is misguided, and that effectively we're massively underestimating how many millions and billions of microbes are responsible for our being on the planet in the first place and staying on the planet in the second place. So effectively, our microbiome is fundamentally linked with our immune system, our GI system, our mental health, and our reproductive system. We are fundamentally microbial, and to go with an approach of literally blitzing everything is short-sighted and will lead to significant consequences. What we need is a targeted approach. So in as much as we have bacteriophages, which are viruses that are capable of targeting particular problem bacteria, we have probiotics that are capable of targeting particular problem viruses. And putting them to good work and doing a targeted approach, re-establishing a balance. We have caused bomb damage to the microbiome, not just of our skin, but of our environment in terms of what we've done. And it is a very big part of the reason why we have this problem in the first place. That we've put so much pesticide pressure, disinfectant pressure, chemical pressure on the planet that we're seeing as a result nature kicking back. So dealing with the problem in the same way as we caused it in the first place is not, in my opinion, the best way to tackle it. I would re-establish the microbiome, the environment, and look at targeted approaches that deal with problem pathogens.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. If I might, shall I just shoot in with 2 more questions that we've had? One from Jamil Juna, who would just like to have the panel's opinion on how the way that Sweden's dealt with the pandemic, just your various inputs on what you think of that. Amanda, you briefly said your thoughts. But if I think that's something that's been asked globally, you know, were they right all along? And then of course there is the effect of what worked in Sweden might definitely not have worked everywhere. But if we can get the panel's opinions on that, and I'll just feed in a last question. Someone was wondering, Stuart, start out again, saying when might we be looking at a date for level 1 lockdown, and how would it look in terms of international travel going forward?
I think it's very hard to judge countries on the basis of the fact they did what they did because they believed it was the best thing for them. So I think ultimately at the end of the day, it's very easy for us to sit in South Africa and judge Sweden in the same way as it's going to be very easy for Sweden to sit there and judge South Africa when all of this is over and done. So I'm going to suspend judgment. I'm going to say they did what they felt was best for them. No one's had the second wave yet, which means that Finland, Norway and Denmark don't know actually whether they're going to get a worse scenario the second time round. So no one's in a position, I don't think, at this point to judge anybody else. I think the best thing is to focus on local and tailor a solution to what we think is best. And much as it's helpful to look at what other countries have done, I think we should learn from it. And switch the mind, think instead of judgment to actually what useful information can we get out of what each country has done, and see if it's at all adaptable to South Africa, if that makes sense. So I've got a soft spot for all of the countries, but I think Sweden just did the best thing Sweden thought it was doing.
Yeah.
Anyone of our task colleagues want to venture an opinion?
Yeah, Prof here. I am on our vaccine study consortium. We actually have a Swedish statistician, and it appears that what the Swedes did wasn't all that much different from what everybody else did, because the Swedes are just such reasonable people. And they did social distancing and they stayed at home. You know, they just did that without having been forced to. So the one thing that the Swedes are themselves disappointed about is that they weren't successful in protecting their vulnerable people. So as part of their strategy to try and keep the virus out of the old age homes, and they didn't quite manage that, which is something they will have to do an autopsy about. But you know, I think I agree with them, and it's just people do what they feel is right, and a variety of reactions to a problem gives us also more opportunities to learn from. I don't think one should be judgmental. One should learn from it. I agree completely. Yeah.
And on the old folks' homes, we picked up very quickly this was going to be a risk point, because everyone else, I mean, Italy have had it for years in terms of their influenza death rate has been always predominantly orientated towards the older population. So in January, we started probiotically protecting a nursing home group. And although it's anecdotal at the moment, they're getting the feeling that they're not seeing the respiratory problems that they would usually experience at this time of year. And obviously that's been in parallel with a global pandemic as well. So I think the elderly folks' homes need a real focus, and it can't just be isolation. It's got to be a protective mechanism that reduces exposure to the virus. And in that respect, you need a fusion blocker or you need an antibody once you get inside the body.
Okay, thanks. Any thoughts, Shahan? When can we fly to the UK again? That's what I really want to know. I ask every week. Go to London. Yeah.
I think it's gonna be difficult to peg a date on international travel. I think until there isn't some kind of way to vaccinate, I think it's going to be difficult for countries to allow people from other countries to come across. At the moment, the only solution is your 14-day isolation when you reach the other country. But I don't think they're going to open up the gates, as Amanda said, until there's some kind of guarantee that the person that you're bringing in from the other region is virus free. And then on that topic, I mean, that was the main issue that Sweden had, was the people that were working in the old age homes were coming from some of the East Bloc countries. They were bringing in the virus into the old age homes. So it was the fact that the Swedes that were living in Sweden weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing. It was the people that were actually working in those old age homes. So the transfer of the virus is going to be a problem until we've found a way to contain it.
Thank you. Well, perhaps as we're entering we've got about 5-10 minutes, but I think it's a good opportunity to, some of the areas we wanted to explore were really about how the media has tackled this. And I suggest we perhaps put that on pause, and we can invite our friends from Carte Blanche to join us and comment on that in a follow-up session. Something that I've really noticed, and something that I've felt for a long time. So at the Chamber here, we believe in sustainable capitalism. You know, Thomas Piketty, the French economist, told us trickle-down economics has failed. Alongside that, I've always questioned why and where we've placed value in society on certain occupations, certain roles. And I've got Jamil Jinnah on the line. He's worked a lot in private equity. Now he works in social impact investment. I've been an entrepreneur myself. Johan, you're a finance guy. But what I have enjoyed is in this Trumpian post-Brexit society, is seeing science and facts come to the fore, the valuing of professors and academics, and using this to inform people, and again, valuing and celebrating it. And I would like us to be involved in a movement that really continues to support that, not just value in terms of listening to people, but I've been speaking to PhD geneticists who are setting up recruitment companies for cleaners because they can make more money doing that. Why are we losing so many good people that we need to tackle these societal problems? So perhaps in conclusion, on everything we've discussed in the last 90 minutes or so, perhaps your comments on how you feel as experts, practitioners in this field that are now being valued, but equally, what have we got to look forward to, or what have we got to fear in the next 100, 360 days? And then perhaps Cecilia and I will just close off. Johan, you seem to straddle both worlds brilliantly. You work for a great cause, but you're a finance man. What are your thoughts there, including thoughts?
Maybe I'm going to say something controversial here, so I hope I don't get shot for it. But I think the academic world sometimes is its own worst enemy. I think there are a lot of academic institutions that stifle innovation. They don't make it easy for academics that are in their fold to be entrepreneurial and be out there and make a difference. I'm not throwing a blanket over them, but I do find that does happen quite a lot. And if you look at what is globally happening at the moment, there is this movement of, yes, let's move away from capitalism and bring in more academics to lead the world. I think personally it's going to be short-lived. Human nature is human nature. At some point, money will talk again. I think while we're in a pandemic, everyone would say, oh, we need to listen to these people. And then 2 years down the line, everyone's memory is short, and then they'll go back to what do the hedge fund managers say, and these kind of guys. But I do hope, in terms of, as I said earlier, this is an opportunity for us to make systemic changes in our society. And I do hope that longer term plans are put in place to get the academics and the thought leaders involved in putting plans in place. That's my hope. And I think you don't just see that in South Africa, you see that across the globe, that there's this talk of pressing the reset button and having an opportunity now to change things. And I hope that's one of the changes that we see, is that we involve these people much, much more.
Thanks. Perhaps come to you, Amanda, then to Prof. Yeah.
I think I'd add, Leon, that as much as our not-for-profit organisations do a lot of good work, you can still be a PTY limited and do good work. And you can be a better kind of business. So at the end of the day, in order to do big projects, you need profits. It's what you spend your profits on that makes the biggest difference, I think. And you know, as we've adopted a socially orientated business model, I think I'd love to move it from social orientation to human orientation. And get people's minds thinking about how can business be better for human beings, as well as the environment and as well as the planet. So it starts with employees. how do we care for our employees as a business? And undoubtedly, we know from all the research that's been done, if you care better for your employees, your customers automatically benefit with better customer service. I think the other thing I think that we missed the opportunity to do, and it's not too late, if I'd been the Department of Health and DTI, I would have issued 2 competitions. One would have been from the Department of Health, creative solutions to COVID-19 from a health solution perspective, and from DTI it would have been economic solutions to COVID-19. And I would have invited the whole country to participate and put in their ideas, and then call it the Mandela COVID-19 and economic awards, and do some prizes for the best solutions, because Department of Health and DTI have got the ability to fast track evaluations. They could pilot them very quickly and see if they work. So I think if the government wanted to do this last minute lasso around everybody's necks and bring them back on board again, inviting the country to participate in our forward movement would be a really good call on their part.
Thanks, Amanda. Thank you. Prof.
Yeah, I think time is a bit advanced, but I very much liked what the other 2 speakers said. You know, I'm basically the person who still has a foot in academia, yet is running a PTY LTD, trying to make people's lives better. And this is actually quite a nice job. And I'm not entirely sure why so few people want to do that. But if, yeah, I enjoy my job here at Task, and this is exactly our agenda. Well, that's what I can say.
Thank you so much, Prof. Cecilia, what are your concluding thoughts and observations? You're on mute, Cecilia. On mute. Yeah.
Sorry, guys. So I actually think we've had some really good news and good results coming out over the past week from some of the good work that's been done. So that's really given me hope again. I mean, Amanda, your idea also fantastic. What Task has done from the start, absolutely fantastic. We've got so much positive data and news now coming out about what people have been doing. I think my big thing is I would really like to see that get as much political will and input into regulation and policy making, and get into the media. If it could get 50% of the exposure and the voice that the negative stuff tends to get, that would make me happy. And I think, but I do think we've probably touched on another webinar topic there, is why is there this disconnect and where is it coming from? And who are the policy makers really listening to? Those are the questions that I'm left with. But all in all, I think there's a lot to be positive about at this point.
Yeah, thank you. No, I mean, it's been quite the last two months have actually been pretty stressful and traumatic for everybody. You know, the world has thrown us into this lockdown period where we felt disempowered, we've worried about the economy, we've worried about our children in terms of not going to school, we've despaired at having to spend every day with our children. And then we've been thrown with, I don't want to say Black Lives Matter, I want to say Lives Matter, with the George Floyd incident and the repercussions we're seeing around the world. And I've sat in the evening with my 13-year-old son in tears, trying to explain to him that the world is still a good place and there's plenty of opportunities for adventure and wonder out there. And I think really just reflecting on everything we've said here today just reinforces and underlines the fact that we as a society, as individuals, can address these problems. We cannot rely on government. We can ask government to create an environment to help us. But what I'm really encouraged to see, and why I love being part of the chamber and part of this community, is bringing people like Task, Umzini, Afro bodies together with Stellenbosch, with Manchester University to solve these problems. And I agree with Johan. I've had one foot in academia for the last 12 years. It can be immensely frustrating. But when we partner with the right commercial organization or not-for-profit organization, we can actually solve problems. And I believe the future of capitalism is, if we solve societal problems, we'll make money and we can grow our economies and we can grow them differently. So the reset button doesn't necessarily have to be one extreme, one or the other. I think it's a blend of us coming together, balancing people with profits, balancing academia with entrepreneurial appetite for change. And if we work together, we're going to solve these problems. As you are at Task, as you are Umzini, as Terence is with his organizations, Afro Bodies are, as many of our members are. So I encourage us to keep coming together, keep being challenging. By all means, we shouldn't sit down, shut up and do as we're told. We need to challenge government when we disagree, but challenge constructively. And I don't support the burning and tearing down statues. I support a good argument to say this is why we should tear down these statues. And we're stumbling on a topic for another webinar here. And I know Eleanor's on from London, and I'd love to talk to you about this. But you know, when I try and look at the world through a 13-year-old's eyes or my other 19-year-old son's eyes, you know, it can be quite scary and tragic. But actually, coming together in this community, being solutions-oriented, analyzing these things, celebrating experts, but also not luxuriating in academia and expertise. We need action. We need to drive forward. We need to drive change. And that is, I believe, what we're doing. I've really enjoyed this session, and that's not necessarily good indications whether you have, so I really hope you have. I'd love to thank our panelists, Prof. And Johan from Task. Just thank you so much for the work that you're doing, but thank you also for your commitment to us today. Amanda, always, thank you for joining us and sharing your insights, and best of luck with Umzini going forward. My colleague Cecilia, thank you for holding the fort with me today and helping us share this conversation. Ema in Mission Control, and my colleagues Leslie and Venice for getting us all in the right place at the right time. And to you, our members, for joining us and being part of this community, a community that believes in business for good, sustainable capitalism, and actually coming forward with a can-do positive attitude. I look forward to communicating with you all in the very near future and to our next webinar session. And I can't wait for that first in-person event when we can grab a glass of wine and not socially distance, but get close to each other again. Hopefully not too far away. Have a great weekend and public holiday, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you.